Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. Einstein was once asked of his contributions, and he said, "We just stand on the shoulders of giants." And the nice thing about coming after Professor John Esposito and Asma Gul Hassan is that I feel the ability to stand on their shoulders. After 9/11, I was invited to lecture in many situations, in churches, synagogues, you name it. And many of the frequently asked questions were repeated. The what is Islam category of questions, why do they hate us, as John mentioned. And after answering most of these frequently asked questions came the real tough one. Well, what can we do about it? How can we fix it? So I was also urged to write a book in which I answered many of these questions and tried to find ways to enable Americans to see the gulf between America and the Muslim world through Muslim eyes, both to see the issues through Muslim eyes and to see America itself through Muslim eyes. One day I was invited to be part of a panel at St. Bartholomew's Church for the Abraham book. And there I met Jane Friedman, who is gracing us today, the chairman of HarperCollins. I didn't know who she was at the time. There was all these people from HarperCollins. I went up to her, and at that very time I was struggling with exactly the formulation, which was, if I had the resources to heal the relationship between the Muslim world and the West, what would I do? And the answer to that question, which I was struggling with at the time, I wrote it up in the form of a paper, which I've called the Cordoba Initiative, which really is the body of chapter 6 of this book. And to somehow relate the ideas of the book to what is happening today, in yesterday's Financial Times, there was a very interesting and very important article titled, "The United States Starts to Think the Unthinkable About Iraq." And the subline said, the rhetoric may still be confident, but Washington is beginning to ponder the wider implications if its war fails. And the consequences of US defeat in Iraq are, in the words of President George Bush, unthinkable. How is failure defined? It is defined partly as the abrupt withdrawal of most US troops while Iraq dissolves into internecine strife. And instead of the democracy that we had hoped to establish in the region, you have the exact opposite. The article went on to continue, while the official position is one of confidence, there is a growing sense, even within the administration, that they are focusing on supporting the newly selected caretaker government as it tries to organize legislative elections by next January. There is no plan B. The article also quoted some Washington conservative ideologues who wanted war on the grounds that Iraq would become a beacon of democracy for the region. In their view, the mission has already failed. And he quoted Fuad Ajami, professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University, who wrote in the New York Times last week that even if Iraq survives, the dream is dead, quote unquote. Let's face it, Iraq is not going to be America's showcase in the Arab Muslim world, admitting that he himself failed to recognize that radical religious beliefs, not democracy, would fill the void left by despotism. Now let me give you the Abdul Rauf plan. Plan B, which should have been plan A. It is by mapping democracy into Islamic vocabulary. This means unpacking what democracy means, because many people think mistakenly that democracy just means the ballot box. And they wonder, well, why is South Africa not developing? Because we think of democracy as just the ballot box and not the component line items of an independent judiciary, an independent press, an independent central bank, not a central bank that could be the president's son could go and just load cash onto the back of a truck. It means a military that does not have to give the imprimatur, a civilian government not influenced by the military. There are a number of things which Americans and most Westerners think of when they say democracy, but they don't really have a clear idea of what it means. So what is required is unpacking each of these line items, mapping it into Islamic vocabulary, and showing how what we mean by democracy is in fact consistent with the very essence of Islam itself. Is identifying each of these component line items and finding its equivalent in Islamic doctrine or law, and communicating both to the Muslim world that this is what it truly wants, this is what it has always wanted since the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and that the revival, which is what many movements historically in the history of Islam have been about, is to revive the dream of the ideal community of Islam, which in most Muslims' minds was exemplified by the Prophet Muhammad's community in Medina. The challenge has always been, which is the challenge of every religious tradition, not only Islam, but Christianity, Judaism, is what are our eternal principles, and how do we restate them in the changing present? This is what we've called, in the middle of the 20th century when I was growing up, the challenge of modernity. Whenever I went with my dad to interfaith ecumenical things, they would say, how does Islam deal with the challenge of modernity? Well, that was a perennial challenge. This is not something new. And the cousin and son-in-law and the caliph, the fourth caliph of Islam, the Caliph Ali, in fact, in one of his very wonderful teachings said, bring up your children for a time different from your own. And by the way, Imam Ali is regarded as being the leader of the Shia community. So therefore, if we want to develop democracy in the region, it can be done, and it must be done, and it cannot be done very well if we project it as an exporting of an American idea. It's not like plunking down a McDonald's in Iraq and cutting a ribbon and saying, here is your democracy. It can't be done that way. Even McDonald's caters to the local taste in different parts of the world. In Malaysia, they'll have spicy sauce, and they'll add things to cater to the local taste. But when we want to export democracy, we have to do it the same way McDonald's does it. And if done that way, and articulate that way, this is how we will be able to wage the important battle, which is the battle for winning the hearts and minds of the Muslim world. There are two battlefronts here, and there are two fronts that I have been battling on. One is the war against terrorism in the name of Islam, the battle against radical Muslim extremists, as I've pointed out in my book, which has to be done by showing them that the original intention of the Prophet's message was exactly this. This is why the third chapter in my book is what is right with America, and to show that what's right with America and what's right with Islam are in fact very much in sync. 7 centuries ago, one of the most important jurists said all of Sharia law is basically the fulfillment of 5 fundamental human rights: the right to life, the right to freedom of religion, the right to family, the right to property, and the right to what is called, under Muslim law, mental well-being. Now, how similar is this to the American Declaration of Independence, which declares that we were created equal, all men, meaning men and women, were created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which, not all, but among which are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which was originally property. Now, when you unpack the concepts and ideas this way, you will see, this is why I call America a Sharia-compliant state. But the other battlefront is convincing US leadership and opinion leaders in this country that not only about this set of ideas, but that ignoring the role of religion, and certainly Islam, but ignoring the role of religion in dealing with the Muslim world and issues in the region is a recipe for disaster and failure. It's like having a mathematical equation with several variables, but a key variable is absent and missing. Your equation will not describe the accurate physics of the situation as physicists speak about. So whether we're trying to deal with nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan, combating extremism in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, if it's about public diplomacy vis-a-vis Iran, or even resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you can only ignore religion at your peril. And this is part of our problem here, because we have been indoctrinated, those of my generation who are now the leaders of this country, have been brought up in a culture where the separation of church and state implied that religion was something you didn't speak about, unless you spoke it only maybe on Saturdays or Sundays in your temples of houses of worship. Now, ignoring religion will result in religious voices getting sucked in the worst possible way. Both Sunni and Shia clerics and parties have expressed reservations about the new government in Iraq, and my fear is that the insistence on imposing a kind of government that ignores the role of religion will result in radical religious parties holding the trump cards. This is what has happened in Israel with Hamas and Hezbollah, because they've not been brought into the equation. This is what led to the rise of, I mean, this is not just only, this is a very, but it's certainly one of the important factors which has led to the rise of extremism in the name of religion. As I point out in the book, I believe this was part of the rise of fundamentalism of the last century, not only in the Muslim world, but also in the West, because religion was dismissed from the boardroom of society. We got to bring religion back in a way that is consistent with both the American notion of what separation of church and state originally meant, which was not that we should not be a religious society, but that the powers of government may not be used to further one religion or one religious doctrine or interpretation over any other. And this very idea is very much consistent with Islamic law. And this is what led to the rise of different schools of interpretation, all of which are recognized under Islamic law as being equally valid. I forgot to take a time off when I started, but I think I'll just end here. I hope you will find the book engaging and interesting and informative, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. I certainly do believe that much of the what has fueled the rise of militancy and terrorism in much of the Muslim world is the inability of many people to be participants in society. Among the notions of democracy is the opportunity, is basically the spreading around of both power and wealth, which are the two sources of conflict. When people feel that they are not able to participate in the power-making decisions or in the economic well-being, then they feel angry. And one has therefore to look at the etiology and the infrastructures. So the challenge that faces much of the Muslim world is developing and building these societies. And as I point out in my book, the development of democracy, and not only democracy in terms of power alone, but also developing the economic well-being of the country, is a very important aspect in terms of addressing the underlying roots of frustration. For instance, many people, just there was an article, I think, in the New York Times last week about people who came from Iraq, soldiers coming from Iraq, and having difficulty integrating themselves back into society, having suicides, murders, divorces, etc. During the 80s and 90s, well, the 80s especially, there was a very strong attempt to draw young Muslim men to participate in the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. Many went, they came back, And what makes you think that the very symptoms and problems that these American soldiers returning from Iraq didn't, and they didn't have a system, they didn't have jobs available, they didn't have Veterans Administration benefits, they are accustomed to violence, and this is what actually developed and helped fuel the rise of the kind of that fueled the rise of this kind of militancy that is purely militant without any reason sometimes. This is why we have to look, the part of the Sufi approach, not only the religious approach, but the contemplative approach in every religious tradition is one of healing and the need to heal people. Those at all levels is a very important thing we need to address. But not only to address it from the spiritual standpoint, but also look at how some of the systems of proper governance can actually bring about this kind of healing. There has been a sense for the last century in much of the Muslim world that Islam has been under attack. It began with not only with the era of colonization, but the nature and quality of colonization, with how the Ottoman Empire was brought to an end, and how Western culture was basically rammed down the throats of many people. And this is one of the points which Huntington points out in his book on the Clash of Civilizations, how torn societies were developed, where the elite were ethnically of the native group, but their mindset, their cultural mindset, down to their clothing, their behavior, their everything, was actually of the West. If you saw the movie Last Samurai or not, but if you look at The Last Samurai and if you study that film from the point of view of its various subcomponents, the challenge of the West, the challenge of holding to tradition, the whole idea of honor, the whole idea of killing oneself, committing suicide for the sake of a cause, all the idea of the honor of being a warrior, all these components and the romanticism of the samurai culture are all part of what Bin Laden stands for. But in spite of that, a century ago there were great Muslim thinkers like Muhammad Abdu, as I point out in my book, and Karen Armstrong points this out as well in her foreword, wanted to take the best of the West and the best of our own traditions. Again, what the movie reflects. We have to be sensitive to our own traditions. And as long as whatever is written expresses the sensitivity to what is essential and fundamental and valuable within Islamic tradition, that is in fact what Muslims themselves need to develop in their own communities and in their own societies. Certainly, as long as that line is recognized and respected, I don't think you'd have a problem. As I point out in my book, Muslims have been in the media a free hit. When I was growing up, cowboy movies would show Westerns would show Native Indians as savages, would show blacks as Tarzan movies would show them as savages. And in much of the movies that we have seen that I grew up with also showed Muslims as being uncouth, womanizers. I mean, there's a certain stereotype which the movie industry really has amplified. Another factor is the issue of race. There's still vestiges within Europe and particularly in America that has not viewed even non-European Christians as on their radar screen.